Wow, thank you so much, Martin, for that generous introduction. And thank you, folks, for coming out on this Friday evening to hear this talk. It's not a very pleasant topic, but I think it's an important topic, and it's one that we need to grapple with. So I'm Dr. Yannielli. I'm a lecturer in history at Aston University. As you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from around here. I came from the United States a few years ago, and I wanted to learn more about Birmingham, which is where Aston is based. One of the nice things about being a teacher is that if you don't know something about anything, you can just teach a class on it. And so I started incorporating local history into my teaching. And eventually we started to run a placement program in which we hired some of our talented students, the most talented students, to research Birmingham's industrial heritage and its connections to slavery and empire. And this is a story that surprised me when I first came to Birmingham because it's a very landlocked city, and it's not usually associated with the history of slavery and empire and abolition, because it's not Bristol, it's not Liverpool, it's not London, it wasn't a center of the slave trade. You didn't see slave ships on the docks in Birmingham, right? But you had all these factories that were developed in Birmingham in the 18th and 19th century, and it turned out that the Industrial Revolution in the Midlands was very deeply tied into the British Empire, and especially the slave trade. And so we want to share a little bit about our research into this topic with you folks tonight. And I brought two of my best student researchers with me, and they're going to take turns explaining to you some of the things that they've been able to uncover on their placement job experience. But I thought, well, first of all, that I could start off with a pitch for Aston University, because we are a relatively new program. We are starting a new single honors history degree next year, and I encourage you all to take out your phones and copy this QR code and pull up the website and check out our course information if you're thinking of applying to university yourself, or if you have friends or family members who might be interested in applying to university. We are one of the up-and-coming history departments in the country. We're one of the most top-rated history programs in the country on the National Student Survey, and we're very proud of what we do at Aston. So that's my pitch to you, to come and check us out at some point. So now that I've said that, I'm not going to talk about Birmingham for a little while. I want to start in Reading, because that's where we are right now. How many of you have seen this before? Raise your hand. One person, excellent researcher, excellent historian. Do you know what this is? Anyone know what this is?
Is that police notice?
Close. Good guess. Anyone else want to take a guess? Yes, correct. So this is a newspaper advertisement for someone who ran away from their enslaver in Reading in about 1750. Okay, this is a scan I made from the newspaper, and it's a little blurry and it's in Old English, so it's not easy to read. So I did provide a transcription for you so that you can read it. And I encourage you to take a close look at this and pay close attention to the language that's being used here and the information that's being provided here. This is what we in the history business call a primary source, an original historical document. And it's the building block of historical research. It's what we use to teach history to our students, and it's what we use to construct our historical arguments. It's the reason why we know anything that happened in the past. And for historians who work on the history of slavery and abolition like myself, these sources are crucial pieces of information about people who were enslaved at a particular place in a particular time. It tells us a lot about who they were, what they were experiencing, what their context was like, what their life was like. It gives us a little window, a little miniature biography into who they were. It doesn't tell us everything, because of course it's not written from their perspective. It's written from the perspective of the person who's trying to capture them, the person who they ran away from. But in this case, in the case of Peter, we can tell some things, right? Peter was enslaved by a man by the name of William Goodchild. And William Goodchild of Reading was a dealer and a chapman. You folks know what a chapman is? Kind of an itinerant trader or a businessman. They would often sell books on the road. They're part of the early book trade in England, and I think it's suitable. Maybe that we're above a bookshop right now. It's very appropriate, perhaps. I don't know if for certain that William Goodchild was a bookseller, but this term chapman is where we get the term chapbook from. Today's a small pamphlet or a book, right? So it's likely that he could have been a book dealer, okay? But he was definitely involved in trading. He was involved in business. He had some connections in London, right? I tried to research a little bit online to see if I could find some baptism records or marriage records or anything like that for Peter or for William. And I didn't make much headway, but that's not to say that that information does not exist. It might still, and some ingenious researcher among you here might be able to ferret it out if you know the proper archives to consult. It's likely that that's something you might be able to find out something more about these two individuals. Baptismal records, marriage records, burial records, or how we know a lot about not only the enslavers but the enslaved in England at this time. So that information might still be out there, and I think it would be worthwhile exploring it further if one of you is interested. So what else can we tell from this ad? Well, Peter is 13 years old. And so he was really a child, teenager, right? And we can make all sorts of inferences based on this information. I'll get more into that in a moment, right? We can tell that he must have had some connection to London because there's a mention of Chandos Street near St. Martin's Lane, which is still there today, okay? And we know that London was a common destination for runaways at this time. The commonly cited estimate for London around 1750, 1760 is about 20,000 people of African descent living in the city. So you can imagine it might have been easy to blend in with the crowd in London, and perhaps he fled from Reading to London for that reason. We don't know. But that's the inference we can make, I think, from this advertisement. What else here? Is there anything here that strikes you? Is there anything here that's confusing for you folks? What do you think?
What was half a guinea worth? It seems quite a high amount to hand over for something lost that's found.
It's a good question. And this is something that historians can debate about, right? Because we don't have an exact conversion table for historical currency. There's actually quite a wide range of data on this subject. And it's difficult to pinpoint what exactly that would be in 23 pounds, for example.
I'm thinking that the rent for a house for a poor person was something like 7p a week. Or
is that true?
like that. You know, which
Okay.
makes half a guinea quite a big sum.
Well, there we have it then. I mean, that's one way to determine relative wealth, right? As you look at how much it would cost to buy something at that time, and you could say, okay, this is a lot more or a lot less than that. And I think when I've looked at other advertisements like this, the rewards tend to be in, what would now be the several hundred pound range, right? It really depends a lot on the person who's advertising for the runaway, and it depends a lot on what their value is to that person. Okay? So yeah, we can learn something from this. So yeah, excellent. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else spot anything here that's curious, you're not sure about, or that strikes you as significant?
Something I've got here. When it says he shall be kindly received, you can see that it's to some extent a controversial matter. That some people might think, well, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
He'll be mistreated. So it shows
Excellent.
you that this is there's already a lot of social consciousness about this.
So I'm glad you made that observation. So what else can we? I'm sorry, I'm putting you in the place of being my students right now, but I just can't help it. As an educator, it's very important for me to have a dialogue on these things. So what else can we learn from this phrase? I think this is really significant. If he will immediately return, he shall be kindly received. What can we infer from that? What do you think? Speak up, sorry.
They usually gave them kindly received, maybe.
Perhaps, yeah. Perhaps he ran away because he was treated badly. Yeah, and so William Goodchild is saying, if you come back, I won't treat you like that anymore. Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption. Anyone else? What can we assume from this? Could have been.
He won't be beaten, which I guess was pretty common.
Yeah, it's possible. Anyone else? What do you think we can infer from this? I think there's one important bit that we haven't mentioned yet.
The
prosecution for harbouring him, for hiding
Okay,
him.
yeah, that's significant. I think we can come back to that. But I'm stuck on this phrase. He shall be kindly received. Why would he write this? Unless Peter could read, and perhaps he would see the advertisement for himself. So I think one important piece of information we can take from this is that's likely that he was literate, which tells us, that he was perhaps unusual.
And it does say if he will immediately return rather than if he will be immediately returned
Yes.
to
Yeah.
his master.
He's talking to him. He's talking to Peter through the ad.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, right? So, this is...
Also involved in it. They will be paid half a guinea. Again, money's involved. It's lucrative.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. So slavery was an economic system, right? People were not enslaved just for the heck of it, right? It was because it was profitable, right? And we get this sense from this, absolutely. So yes, excellent observation. But yeah, so I think, there's a dialogue going on here between Peter and William. I think that there's maybe even a negotiation going on here about treatment, okay? And it may be that William's hoping that Peter will return to him if he sees this advertisement. So this is an interesting form of resistance to enslavement, right? And somebody mentioned this fact of whoever harbors him shall be prosecuted. What do you think that means? Whoever harbors him. Why would somebody harbor him?
Don't protect him because otherwise we'll bring you to the full force of the law.
Yeah,
You can't keep my slave.
yeah. So there's a threat
Yeah.
being made here. It's very overt. And I think we can kind of read between the lines here and say that, well, the reason they need to say this is because people were helping fugitive slaves.
Yeah.
There was an underground railroad in operation, perhaps in London at this time, right? And that's significant, right? So there's a lot of resistance going on. Slavery wasn't just accepted by everyone. There were people who helped runaways. And that's an important insight. And there's a lot more that we could say about this advertisement. I think you folks did great. Thank you for helping me talk through that interpretation. Again, this is a really fascinating historical document. One part that jumped out to me right away is in the first line, went away from his master, a black boy. And I couldn't help thinking of the Black Boy pub nearby. And I know that it recently changed its name a couple of years ago. And I know that there's some controversy about where the name the Black Boy came from. What does it refer to exactly? I doubt it refers to Peter. But it shows you that phrase was current at the time, right? And I couldn't help noticing that kind of connection there. Okay, so what else can we tell about Peter from Reading? Well, we have paintings of enslaved children from that time period, someone who's maybe 12, 13 years old, what they looked like, what they would do. This is a painting that currently hangs in Aston Hall in Birmingham, which is a big palatial mansion. And it gives you a sense of what a person like this would have looked like. They're kind of hidden in the background, right-hand side there. I don't know if I can use this. So this is the part that I zoomed in on here on the right side, okay? So you can get a closer look at this, because he's not the focus of the painting, right? These people are the focus of the painting. This is just kind of, these are the servants on the side. Anything else you notice that's interesting about this?
Well, there's a white servant as well, but
Sure.
she
Yeah.
she looks a bit more well. They both look quite well dressed.
Got a white woman there, yeah. So we know that servitude was,
His headdress or what he's wearing on his...
he's got a turban.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, we can speculate as to why that's the case. It could have been just a way that wealthy Britons like to dress up their servants, right? To emphasize their exoticism, their otherness, right? Or it could have been something that this particular child chose to wear. We don't really know for sure. Anything else? You're doing great so far, folks.
I brought him.
Say
I
again?
brought him from India.
He might be. Yeah, it's hard to tell for sure if this is someone who's maybe of southern Indian descent or African descent. So I think that's a fair observation. Anyone else?
He looks quite happy or
Perhaps.
contented.
Yeah. Obviously he didn't paint the image, right? So we're seeing what the artist wants us to see. And I think it's important to remember that. Okay. Anything else?
It's only about 50 years before Queen Victoria, and she had black pages who she brought in from actually mostly India, but they had black
Sure.
child
Yeah.
servants, page boys.
Yeah. It's interesting you use this term page, or page boy. I think we can say with almost total certainty that this was not just a servant, but this was somebody who was enslaved. Why do you think I can say that with such certitude?
These are young.
Perhaps, yeah, it's part of it. Yeah, as a child. Anything else?
Only have one name,
Well, we don't know the name necessarily in this case.
but in the advert it was answers to the
For Peter, yes, if we're talking about Peter, yes. Yeah, so that's clear, the case for Peter. But I'm talking about this child right here, this boy.
I think. Yes, something.
You got it. He's wearing a metal collar around his neck. Yeah, yeah. And you might not be able to tell right away unless you knew to look for it. Eagle-eyed, very good interpretation there. And I can tell because I've read sources from this time period, and I knew that enslaved people wore metal collars. It's one of the ways that they were controlled. And we can see this in other paintings as well. So this is a painting from a National Trust property in Warwickshire. And I kind of, again, zoomed in on it, and I used the black and white version there so you could see the collar a little better around this child's neck. Okay. Here's another example from about 1725. And this painting, interestingly, was originally titled Young Girl and a Page. And this is one of the ways I think that the existence of black people and enslaved people in England has been erased. Perhaps not on purpose, but over time, by labeling paintings like this, you get a sense that, oh, he's just a page. Actually, he's an enslaved child, and we can tell because, again, oops, sorry. Skipped too far ahead there.
Pearl as well. Have a look at it.
So, again, you could tell because of the metal collar. And yes, you said it could be a pearl there. I think that is actually a bell.
The bell.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And one of the reasons I think that is because the dog has a similar collar, right? And so what can we infer from this? I won't put you through the ringer again. I'll just say that, this was a way of emphasizing that enslaved people were almost like pets for certain wealthy British families at this time, right? They were part of their retinue, way of displaying their conspicuous wealth, okay, of showing off to other wealthy people, right? And that's why they were often included in paintings like this on display, okay, because they were luxury items.
But at what point did they actually use these collars? I mean, did they get locked up at night? Some use the collars, or was it only if they were going out in a group or something? I mean,
It's a good question. And from what I can tell from the sources, they were locked on all the time, because if you escaped, your owner's name sometimes is engraved in the collar, and that's how you were captured and returned.
but you're
okay.
not. But they're not locked up with the collar when they're working, as it were. With the child or with the serving the family or anything. It's just if they're by themselves in a room or something.
No, I think all the time.
I
I think all the time.
They're
Yeah.
not attached. Are they attached to something?
No, I don't think so. No. It's just like a dog collar or a cat collar, right? Now, we don't know that this was what Peter looked like. We don't know that he wore a metal collar. We can kind of infer from the sources, again, because we have so many paintings that depict this. This is another example from around the same time period, and you can see the enslaved child there on the right-hand side, again, with the metal collar around his neck. This is a fairly famous example because that big guy in the middle there is Elihu Yale. Do you folks know who that is? He's Welsh, very famous where I'm from in the US because he's the namesake of Yale University, my alma mater. That's where I went to school. And there's been a lot of controversy about this painting there, and some interesting research has gone into determining exactly what's going on here. But Elihu Yale was, of course, a slave trader. He worked for the East India Company in what was then Madras, what's now Chennai, India. And he grew extremely wealthy there as a governor for the East India Company. And this painting displays that conspicuous wealth, including, again, the enslaved child. Okay? One of my favorite responses to this painting was done a few years ago. This was created by an artist named Titus Kaffar. It's called Enough About You. And as you can see, it kind of crumples up the left-hand side there because, again, our eye is drawn to the left-hand side and refocuses our attention on the child. Frames him, removes the metal collar from his neck, okay, and says, maybe it's time to focus on you. What can we find out about you? And that's really what part of my work was all about. Again, though, I think we have to talk about these collars because this is where things connect to Birmingham, where we've been doing our research. It turns out that they were made in Birmingham. And this is one of the reasons why the city of Birmingham became renowned as a center of industry and prosperity. Was because it was supplying the slave trade with guns, first and foremost, but also with shackles and chains and handcuffs and metal collars. And this guy on the right, Moses Roper, was enslaved in the United States in what's now Florida, the state of Florida. And he escaped and ended up in England. And he was walking down the street in Birmingham one day, and he saw these collars and handcuffs in the window that he recognized because he had been enslaved himself and he had seen them used on others. So he went into the store, and the clerk assumed that he was a planter from Jamaica or Barbados or something, and he showed him different examples. Some of them had spikes inside. So you get a sense of how these devices were used, especially in the Americas, as a form of torture. Okay, they were less about ostentatious display in the American context, and more about just control of people's movement, people's freedom. Right. That's not to say that they weren't torture devices in England as well. They certainly were. But it's interesting to see this, right? This comparison. And even after slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s, Birmingham manufacturers continued to produce these collars. Around 1840, the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society looked into this. I took this from a report that they published called British Capital and the Slave Trade, because they were interested in finding out exactly how much of British money, industry, capital was implicated in the slave trade even after the abolition of slavery in the UK. And it turns out quite a lot. Okay, so they discovered that this business was still thriving in Birmingham, and this phrase that they end up on, I think, is really important. Turn which way we would, we found British capital directly engaged in the slave trade, upholding it both at home and abroad. So this became a huge problem for British abolitionists because this whole industry had been built up in the UK around supplying the slave trade, and even after abolition, it was still doing that, and the British economy was still dependent on slavery in many different ways. And abolitionists recognized this, and they thought about ways to get around it. This guy, Joseph Sturge, based in Birmingham, and was especially involved in promoting during the 1850s what was called the free labor movement, which means that we would create a whole alternative economy to the slave labor economy that was built on free labor, that is wage labor. And Sturge's idea was that if we could encourage enough people to produce free labor, cotton, sugar, rice, anything that's made by slaves, right, we could try to remove the complicity of everyone really in the UK from involvement in slavery through their purchases. It's a really interesting idea. It required a lot of documentation, as you might imagine, to prove that materials were actually free from slave labor. This is one example from the US, free labor cotton label. And similar labels were used in the UK to indicate that goods for sale were not tainted by connection with the slave trade. This is the origin of what we now call fair trade. Okay, this is where it begins. And what's really interesting is that there's just about 100 years, less than 100 years between that first advertisement that I showed you for Peter and the appearance of this free labor movement, right? So we have that first historical document, that primary source, that runaway advertisement, and this historical document, this free labor cotton label. And I think that they're connected. I think that you can't have one without the other because of the resistance of people like Peter. We were able to develop an anti-slavery consciousness in this country. And abolitionists started looking for ways to remove themselves from complicity with slavery, right? So these two things are intimately connected. And you're going to hear more in a moment from my student researchers about these connections and about the free labor movement. Thank you very much for listening.
Hello everyone, my name is Safiah Al-Shatheli. I'm a student at Aston studying History and International Relations, and I'm going to be talking to you guys about the Birmingham sugar boycott that was organised by the female anti-slavery group, the Female Society of Birmingham, in 1828. So before we begin, I've got a question for everyone. Thinking about the world we live in today, can we live freely with ethically sourced products? So if you think yes, just raise your hands. And if you think no, raise your hands. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to tell you about sugar boycotts. So the sugar boycott in Birmingham was not the first boycott of sugar. In fact, it was part of the many boycotts of slave-produced products during the 18th and 19th century. They were led by British and American Quakers. Abolitionists initiated sugar boycotts as they wanted to end slavery and the slave trade because sugar was a major commodity and it was produced by slaves in the Caribbean, therefore boycotting it would bring an end to the slave trade. The sugar boycotts were a form of economic protest as consumers refused to purchase sugar that was produced by slaves. This then put pressure on slave owners and governments that supported the slave trade, as this would affect their profit and then lead to an end to slavery. By affecting their profits, they kind of hit them where it hurt the most. So, Quakers. Quakers were a group of Protestants who believed that there was something of God in everybody. Each human is of unique worth. Quakers valued that all people are equal and oppose anything that may harm or threaten them. This meant that they were against slavery as it was against their Christian values, as it saw the harm of innocent human beings. Furthermore, the Quakers did everything in their power to bring an end to slavery. So, the Female Society of Birmingham was created on the 8th of April 1825 when Lucy Townsend held a meeting in her home in West Bromwich, which is just on the outskirts of Birmingham. She held this meeting for women to come together and discuss their roles in the anti-slavery movement and what they can do to bring an end to slavery. The society was an anti-slavery society that pushed for an immediate abolition of slavery, and because many abolitionists pushed for a gradual abolition, which saw slaves still work under their owners because it meant that slavery would be abolished over time. The society was the first ever female anti-slavery society in the world, and due to that, many anti-slavery societies dismissed them, even though their successful campaigns had an impact on the course of the anti-slavery movement. It also inspired the creation of other anti-female anti-slavery societies all over the world and was a key factor of showing the role of women in the anti-slavery movement. The founding members included Lucy Townsend, Mary Lloyd, Elizabeth Hayrick, Sophia Sturge, and Sarah Wedgwood. The society promoted the cause of abolition through fundraising, education, and direct action. They raised money for anti-slavery organisations all over Britain and boycotted goods that were produced by slave labour. They had several ways of promoting their anti-slavery campaign. This included by publishing pamphlets, which showed the horrors of slavery, as well as giving out handbags that had printed images on them which showed slave plantations. These methods educated people on slavery and encouraged people to call for an immediate end and a change to the abolitionist movement. So, Elizabeth Hayrick is one of the founding members of the society, who fought to bring an end to the slave trade. Born in Leicester in 1769, Elizabeth Hayrick was a philanthropist, abolitionist who fought to bring an end to slavery. After the death of her husband in 1795, she became a Quaker and fought for social reform. Herrick began to get involved in the anti-slavery movement in the early 19th century, when there was a growing opposition from the public to abolish slavery. Herrick was also a member of the Society for Migration and Gradual Abolition for Slavery, which argued for the gradual emancipation of slaves. However, Herrick became frustrated with the rate of the abolitionist movement and the movement that it was going at, and she believed that gradualism was ineffective and unjust. This pushed her to publish a pamphlet in 1824 called Immediate Not Gradual Abolition. And she also encouraged people to boycott sugar when she published a pamphlet called Appeal to the Hearts and Consciences of British Women, where she encouraged women to not purchase slave-produced sugar. Herrick contributed to the Society's methods to gain attention for the anti-slavery cause and for immediate abolition through publishing anti-slavery literature, organising meetings and rallies. Elizabeth Herrick was also involved in other social causes such as promoting women's rights and education. So, Immediate Gradual Abolition was published in 1824. And it was a pamphlet that Herrick wrote, and she argued that there should be an immediate anti-slavery, not a gradual one. In the pamphlet, Herrick argued that slavery was a moral evil and that it must end immediately, so that slave owners could not get compensation. In the pamphlet, Herrick also argued that gradual abolition was unjust and ineffective, as it allowed slave owners to continue to profit off slave labour and allowed slaves to still be suffering for an undetermined amount of time, which then delayed the inevitable end to slavery. And this is her main argument as to why there should be an immediate end, not a gradual one. Herrick also argues that individuals have the power to change because they can refuse to take part in the slave economy by not purchasing goods produced by slaves. The Appeal to the Hearts and Consciences of British Women was another pamphlet written by Herrick in 1828. In the pamphlet, Herrick argued that slavery was a moral evil and that women had the influence to end it and that they should use that influence. She highlights that women have an influence because they are the mothers and the wives of the men who control or are part of the slave trade. Therefore, they have the influence on those directly involved. Herrick also encourages women to boycott sugar and other products produced by slave labour. She concluded by telling women to educate themselves on slavery in order to bring a change. Both Immediate Not Gradual Abolition and The Appeal to the Hearts and Consciences of British Women were successful pieces of anti-slavery literature. Herrick's publication of Immediate Not Gradual Abolition changed the course of the anti-slavery movement within Britain, as abolitionists began to call for an immediate end, not a gradual one. Furthermore, The Appeal to the Hearts and Consciences of British Women kick-started the sugar boycott in Birmingham, and it had a massive part in the success of the boycott. Appealing to women and calling for them to join the anti-slavery movement was significant, and it showed that women can make a difference and that they most definitely have the power to do so. So, alongside the publication of pamphlets, to encourage people to call for an immediate end to abolition and to boycott sugar, society also created bags that had pictures printed on the front of them, which showed slave plantations, as you can see, and it showed the punishments that people were subjected to. There's going to be a bag that's going to be passed around which shows.
I printed a replica bag so you can take a closer look at it. Pass it around. Thank you.
You see, by the 1820s, the demand for handbags increased, and the society saw this as an opportunity. The women of society made these bags and included pamphlets, poems, and tracts that were written by anti-slavery campaigners inside them. As well as that, they gave these bags out to people, and they gave them a card alongside them which explained the purpose of the bag. The bags were a highly effective way to get the message and the aims of the society to people who were not members. And the campaign was extremely successful and reached many people all over Britain. In fact, it is said that the Duchess of Kent received one of these bags. And for those who don't know who she is the mother of the future Queen Victoria, who also opposed slavery. So, like I said, here's a few examples, but I'm going to focus on this one here. The image shows a black woman holding a child in her arms, and it shows a man standing over her with a whip. It also shows some slaves working on the plantation in the background. It is not clear from the picture, but this man here is not white. He's either mixed race or he's black, which is very unusual, as we usually tend to see white men as kind of the ones with the power, the ones with the weapons, and the ones in control of the slaves. Now, this man is actually an overseer, and overseers were individuals who were entrusted with supervisory roles. The reasons for black overseers varied. In some cases, they were trusted and skilled slaves who were seen as capable of managing other enslaved labourers. These black overseers might have had privileges or slightly better living conditions than other enslaved individuals. It is important to recognise that the presence of black overseers did not alter the brutal and dehumanising nature of slavery. Enslaved overseers were often put in difficult positions, as they had to carry out the orders of the masters, which would be cruel and oppressive to the enslaved people they were overseeing. This image displays the power dynamics between the enslaved people, as the overseer had total control over the slaves on the plantation, as he has a weapon which gives him the power to order the slaves to do what he says. Whereas a woman is holding her child helpless and unable to escape what she was told to. Through this image, the society showed the power imbalances between the enslaved people and highlights that slavery is not just black versus white. Also, there is a quote just here, and the quote says, "The driver's whip unfolds its torturing coil. She only sulks, go and lash her to her toil." Now, the tone of that is very significant. I mean, it's quite ruthless and it's indifferent to the woman's suffering, and it reflects inhumane treatment of slaves. Furthermore, the quote describes the man as a driver, which reinforces the power dynamics between the overseer and the slave, because the driver is always in control. I mean, when you're in a car, the driver has control over whether it's going left or it's going off a cliff. The passenger has no say in, what direction the car is going in. And clearly, if we had to put in that reference, the woman has no power. It also says the driver's whip unfolds its torturing coil. This emphasizes the whip's potential for inflicting pain and suffering and re-establishes the power the overseer has. The second sentence says, "She only sulks, go and lash her to her toil," which shows that the woman can only sulk and she will still be subjected to punishment. The woman can express any concerns or grievances she may have. Instead of addressing them, the overseer will just punish her. I mean, just from the image and this quote, the society has shown that there's a power hierarchy within the enslaved people, and the ones at the bottom are the ones that suffer the most. At the back of the bag, there's also a poem which says, "Negro woman, who sittest pining in captivity, and weepest over thy sick child. Though no one seeth, God see thee. Though no one pitieth thee, God pitieth thee. Raise thy voice, forlorn and abandoned one. Call upon him from amidst thy bonds, for assuredly he will hear thee." This poem offers a message of solace and hope to a suffering woman by emphasizing the presence and compassion of God. It encourages her to have faith and reach out to God for support, suggesting that divine intervention can provide relief in times of hardship. Through this poem, the society has shown that slavery is against the values of Christianity, which is very important because it is a way of changing people's minds about slavery. If they know that it's against the values of Christianity, it will push them to call for abolition, for immediate abolition. As well, the bag is also made of silk, which is very important because silk was a material that was not produced by slave labour like cotton. By creating these bags, the society shows the conditions that slaves are living in and the torture that they are subjected to. Furthermore, it highlights that slavery is an evil and against Christianity. So, the sugar boycott in Birmingham. The Female Society for Birmingham Sugar Boycott was a boycott that encouraged women to not buy slave-produced sugar from the West Indies. It started in 1828 and it lasted an entire year. They encouraged women to buy East Indian sugar as it was free grown and not produced by slaves. They also taught people to use other sweeteners such as honey and syrup. The society organised the boycott because it would lead to a decrease in demand for slave-grown sugar, which would then lead to slavery itself being viewed as non-profitable, as companies who sell slave-produced sugar would lose profit, thus bringing an end to the slave trade. The boycott was a success. A year later, 25% of Birmingham no longer used West Indies sugar. The sugar boycott was successful, as many people in Birmingham refused to buy sugar produced by slave labour. However, a year later, after the boycott started, it began to lose momentum and eventually led to the boycott ending in 1829. This happened for several reasons. Firstly, the boycott ended because it was difficult to sustain over a long period of time. The members of the society had to find alternative sweeteners and had to make significant changes to their diets, which is not easy to do. And there was now a growing pressure to provide alternatives to West Indies sugar as more people joined the boycott. Secondly, the boycott ended because it did not have widespread support. Yes, the people in Birmingham followed the boycott, but others in Britain did not. This limited the impact of the boycott. Furthermore, the British government was slow to act on abolition of slavery. As a result, it made it difficult for the boycott to have a lasting impact. Finally, the boycott ended due to the opposition it faced from those who profited from slavery. Rumours began to spread that the boycott was ineffective, which meant that some believed that boycotted slave-produced sugar had no use. They would also argue that sugar that was produced by free labour was inferior to sugar produced by slave labour. So, was it successful? Firstly, yes, it can be deemed successful, as it brought awareness to the anti-slavery cause and encouraged people to call for an immediate abolition. It was also a success as they were able to hinder the profits of the companies that sold slave-produced sugar. As well, the boycott did have strong support within Birmingham and its surrounding areas. Furthermore, the boycott was able to last an entire year. And looking at that at face value might not seem as much. But for an entire year, businesses within Birmingham that sold slave-produced sugar lost the profits, and it would make it very difficult for them to come back from that. And even though the boycott was a success, it also had its failures. Firstly, the sugar boycott was unable to gain national support, as it was only able to generate support in Birmingham. Secondly, it was not a success because even though the East Indian sugar was free of slave labour, the Indian labourers that worked on the sugar plantations worked in exploitative conditions. So even though they were no longer purchasing sugar produced by slaves, they were now purchasing sugar that was not produced ethically. And also, the boycott was a failure as many only joined because they thought it was fashionable. This is because many women were joining the boycott, and those who did not believe in the cause only joined in to fit in. This then questions the intentions of some of the people who joined the boycott and whether they fully committed to the boycott. Looking at the sugar boycott and its success and failures raises the question, can we live without slave labour goods? In my opinion, I think you cannot, because in the 18th century, a man called Benjamin Lay tried to live without slave-produced products, and he ended up living in a cave. So if he couldn't do it then, we most certainly cannot do it now. And even though slavery is abolished, it is extremely difficult to live freely with ethically sourced products, as people all over the world are still working in dangerous and unexploitative conditions today. Thank you.
Following on from the previous discussions, I want to talk about complicity in business, but also fair trade. And I want to point to a historical example, which is Cadbury Brothers Limited versus the Standard Limited. This was a libel trial held in Birmingham, and in 1908, the Standard accused Cadbury of hypocrisy for buying cocoa from Sao Tome and Principe. And as a result, Cadbury took the Standard to court. But what is this? Why is it important? And I think we need to understand who the Cadburys were first. Initially, it was George and Richard Cadbury, and of course they were known for chocolate, for Cadbury World, But they were also known for their philanthropy, and they were really big anti-slavery activists. They were members of the Aborigines Protection Society, the Congo Reform Association, and the Anti-Slavery Society. And they were Quakers as well, and they were really big pacifists. And this was reflected in the way that they did business, or some of the business that they did. And they were a really nice, refreshing reminder of how, in an era of workhouses and deserving poors and undeserving poors, they were a reminder of how progressive businesses and people could be, even at the height of the British Empire. And they were also the creators of the model village Bourneville, which is in Birmingham. And that was a place where the employees of Cadbury could work safely and they could earn a nice wage. And it was particularly good for young single women as well. So considering all of this, it might have come as a shock when the Standard published all those claims about Cadbury. Or was it a shock? Well, we need to understand Sao Tome and Principe, which is here. Sao Tome and Principe was a part of Portuguese West Africa, and it was just off the coast of West Africa. And it's only a relatively new country. They gained independence in 1975 from Portugal. But what preceded this was quite complicated. Slavery was legally abolished on the islands in 1869. What continued after was a form of legalised slavery. And this was discovered by the investigative journalist Henry Nevinson in his 1906 book, A Modern Slavery. So he went to the islands to discover what was happening, and he found that a lot of deceitful tactics were being used to lure people back into this form of slavery. People would be kidnapped from mainland Africa and brought to the islands. They worked 10 hours a day. They lived in inadequate housing. They didn't have the right clothes. They didn't have the right nutrition. And there was a high level of surveillance on the island, which means that people couldn't escape. And repatriation after slavery was legally abolished was practically non-existent because plantation owners had to pay into the system. And of course, they didn't pay in, which was not good for the people on the islands. So, considering that the Cadburys were such big humanitarians, it's hard to believe that they didn't know this. But they kind of did, because in the early 1900s, William Cadbury, who was George Cadbury's nephew and also a big member of the company, was offered an estate in Sao Tome and Principe, which came with 200 black slaves. And this was after it was legally abolished. And there's a bit of a mystery as to when the Cadbury Company actually knew what was happening and when they knew. It could have been when this estate was offered to William Cadbury. It could have been in 1902 when a Foreign Office report was published on the islands. Or it could have been in 1906 when Nevinson's book was published. And because all of these rumours were swirling, Cadbury sent Joseph Burt, who was a member of the company, to the islands to write a report about what was happening, and they had their suspicions confirmed. It's also important that we need to consider the role of the British government, because not only is it a matter of slavery, it's also a diplomatic issue, because it involves the Portuguese government as well. And they were left in a bit of a predicament because they didn't know what to do. They had pressure mounting from the humanitarian side to end slavery, to end this legalised form of slavery. But then the British government also wanted slaves from Mozambique to work in the mines in South Africa. And so they needed to have this relationship, this friendly relationship with the Portuguese government as well. And there's talk of a mystery meeting between Edward Grey, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, Joseph Burt and William Cadbury. And there's only talk of this meeting because there's no actual physical paper evidence of this meeting happening. And within the meeting, Edward Grey says to the two of them, we need to have a diplomatic approach. We can't publish this report you've written. Let's not aggravate the Portuguese government. And this all culminates in an article published by The Standard on the 26th of September, 1908, where they call Cadbury out for their hypocrisy regarding Bourneville and the white workers of Bourneville, and compared them to the workers of Sao Tome and Principe, the slaves of Sao Tome and Principe. And for a conservative newspaper, they were surprisingly apt in their analysis of colonial policy and British paternalism. But this language, this colonial language and this British paternalism was apparent throughout the article, and it comes out during the trial as well. But The Standard weren't the only newspaper to accuse the Cadburys. The Guardian published an article, the Evening Standard published an article, and a local newspaper called John Bull also produced an article, but they were all forced to apologise for misrepresenting the company. The company didn't like that they were saying this about them. And so the Standard didn't apologise, and in the end they had to take them to court. And it was a libel trial. The trial took place in the Victoria Law Courts in Birmingham, which is actually next to Aston University, and this happened in 1909. And it attracted a lot of attention because in a lot of the literature as well, it says that it was almost like a little election being fought out in the courtrooms because there was an upcoming election at the time, but also the actors involved in the trial are important too. The Standard was represented by Edward Carson, who was a Conservative MP, and Cadbury was represented by Rufus Isaacs, who was a Liberal.
Reading.
It's Reading.
But before the trial even ended, Cadbury, along with other British confectionery companies, decided to stop buying cocoa from Sao Tome and Principe, which is good, but this was before the trial even ended, and before we even get to the point of the ending, we need to consider this other point of contention within the trial, and that was the role of the Daily News. And the Daily News was a Liberal newspaper owned by George Cadbury. And they were a big Liberal newspaper. They were really critical of the Conservatives at the time. They were really critical of the Boer War and colonial policy. And they even declined to send cocoa to Sao Tome and Principe, not to Sao Tome, but to South Africa and to the troops in South Africa. And the Conservative Edward Carson, who represented the Standard, points that out. Why did you talk so much about the Conservatives? Why did you talk about South Africa so much and then publish almost nothing about Sao Tome and Principe? And he's right, but then it's this language that comes out throughout the trial, this colonial language, this British attitude, this paternalism, and it's these African deaths that were trivialised throughout the debate. It was all about the Cadburys, it was all about their reputation, what people say, what they boycott our cocoa. And in the end, the Cadburys actually did win, but they were only awarded damages of 1 farthing, so these were contentious damages. And it was all about their reputation, but I don't think their reputation actually did suffer, because in 1905, they made profits of just over 1 million, and then 5 years after the trial in 1914, they had over 2.3 million in profits. So I can't say that their reputations are damaged at all. But what happened to the people of Sao Tome and Principe? Well, the humanitarian group's efforts weren't as fruitful as they thought they would be because this form of indentured labour actually returned to the islands after the First World War. And I think this case is really important in understanding the Edwardian attitudes at the time, which parallel today. There's a lot to be understood about corporate responsibility, but also the responsibility we have as consumers. Thank you for listening.
All right, we've got time for questions.
Can I ask a question? I'd like to know the difference between after the boycott of the sugar, the West Indian sugar, and then South the Asians was doing the sugar. And you mentioned about one, there's like a double standard. The slave were just, the Africans they were more or less, they were ethical. So, but what's the difference between the Asian who were doing the sugar? They're not slaves. You didn't class them as being slaves, even though they were doing sugar on the plantation.
That's because by that time, India was part of the British Empire, and obviously with slavery in 1807 they abolished it, but it was called gradual abolition. So it meant they were not slaves, but they were still working under their under their own masters, and so that
For free?
for free, so they don't make a loss and make profits. The difference is that these Indian labourers were paid, but they were just not working in ethical conditions and they were being exploited. So they were working long hours and being paid just enough to get food for the week. So the difference was that they weren't owned by anyone, but they still weren't being treated fairly. Just like today, how you have people working in China earning 10p to make a £10 top, and it doesn't correlate. They're still being paid, they're not owned, but they're still working in exploitative conditions. So it's not ethical. So that comes into question as well.
I've got a question. What do we know about the social status of ladies like K-Rich and those people? Do we know where their money came from, where their income came from, or whether they had wealth, or were they landed, or were they sort of associated with trade masters, or?
Well, it varied quite a bit. Some came from a wealthy side, which allowed them, well, from a wealthy family, which allowed them to educate themselves, and so that they had the information to kind of go out and call for an end to slavery. Some had, some of their parents were tradesmen, just everyday people working, blacksmiths and stuff like that, and they were able to get some sort of education, and which allowed them to go out and call for an end.
Let's say you put under no, when you said was it successful, you put under no that it wasn't successful because it involved virtue signalling. Now I think it was successful because it involved virtue signalling, because virtue signalling signals virtue to other people, But I think that should have gone in the yes, because it put a kind of moral pressure on people who would not have felt the moral pressure, So I think that I would put it in the yes bit.
I disagree. I think it's just a token. It's just a token effort, and it almost blunts the desire to change things more radically. Because people are doing it more for how people will perceive them, as opposed to actually stop the injustice. Being concerned about the real injustice.
But that's a moral question. That's not about efficacy, is it? That's an internal moral question. Whereas I would say that all those people that were doing it, and how do we really know that they were doing it for that reason? But even if we did know, if they were doing it for that reason, nevertheless they were doing it.
And it was only the rich and the wealthy who could afford to kind of boycott those products anyway. So it was only a small section of the privileged classes who could actually do that.
Why?
How do you know?
How would you know that?
Well, in fact,
That happens today.
I mean, other people boycott it because they couldn't afford it, right? So it's just people didn't really use sugar. Was a luxury from centuries, or generations. So I suppose you could say that the poorer people didn't have sugar because they couldn't afford to buy sugar. Actually, it wasn't cheap, But I think the moral questions, there are two different moral questions. One is whether something is not worth doing because you're doing it for, your own personal, somehow, virtue signalling. But I think nevertheless it happened. Those were people, we don't even know who was doing it for virtue signalling, do we? I mean, did anyone say, I'm only doing this because I want to get on well with my boyfriend's mother or something?
I mean, nobody's going to admit that.
Well, who's going to tell them? Who's going to say, you're doing it for that reason, you're doing it for a really good reason? Nobody is. You're not able to tell that.
It's a really fascinating debate, and I think it pertains to boycotts even today. And what's interesting is that this was really one of the first boycotts,
Yes.
right? And we can still see the same tension between these two different interpretations. Are boycotts successful? Should we be doing them? Or is it just a waste of time? Is it just signaling your virtue? Is it making it more about yourself rather than the people you're trying to help? I mean, I think it's an ongoing conversation. I don't think there's one right answer. We can have this debate all night. I saw a question in the back, and maybe we can... Do you have your hand up?
I might have had a misunderstanding when you were talking about the overseer, and it wasn't just white people that enslaved, and it gave me the impression that you were saying black people were enslaving black people, but my understanding was the overseer was still a slave.
yeah, he was a slave. It's kind of looking at the kind of hierarchy within slavery itself. So it was the overseer had some sort of, kind of more of a status over than the woman who was less of just a normal slave working on the plantation. He was trusted enough by the master to kind of order them to do their jobs. He trusted them to punish them and stuff like that, which is quite significant within itself. But it's important to notice that just because he was black doesn't mean he was lenient, and in fact he had orders to follow himself. So,
But that's he was doing that to please, to maybe make his life more comfortable, but he's still a slave, he's still enslaved, so he wasn't any different in much respects to the woman that he was whipping. He's, he was still wearing the same shackles, be it mentally.
Yeah.
Safiah, why do you think that the Women's Anti-Slavery Society in Birmingham decided to show an enslaved overseer rather than a white overseer on this propaganda that they were producing? What was the reason for that?
Well, it could vary. I think the main reason is to show that it's not just black versus white, which is what you get, the kind of sort of impression you get when it comes to slavery as well. If you look at Haiti, you had, black people who were free, but also had plantations as well. So it was kind of educating people on everything and trying to show them that even though he's overseeing her, he's kind of, in control of the situation, that he's also enslaved himself because he's being told to do this, he's being forced to do this, whether he wants to or not. He has to do this, whether he likes it or not. And it kind of shows that whatever level there is within slavery, every single one of them is still suffering, even though it's been abolished. They're still suffering, and it needs to come to an immediate end. Can
I ask you about? Sorry about that. You talked about sort of like the collaboration between the Portuguese, with the chocolate cabarets, the Portuguese and the English, and they needed to sort of like come to some kind of agreement. Do you know whether there was one particular nation that was more, persevered with slavery to a greater extent than
Belgium. Would you agree?
Which one?
Belgium. King Leopold
and they kept it up
of the Congo, big time. Yeah.
But the Portuguese were still persevering right until the sort of late 1800s, were they? Or?
Yeah. 1888. Yeah. That's another
I
question.
wanted to ask the question about Peter. I read the book Black and British by David Eluso.
Great book. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
But there was a significant trial in 1772.
Somerset.
Yeah, and it was on the basis of this slave that had been severely beaten, and I think somebody took him in. I'm wondering, was that Peter?
No.
It wasn't?
No. His name was Somerset. It's a fascinating case, and this is really where historians tend to date the abolition of slavery within England to 1772. But there are others, Simon Newman among them, was a leading historian of slavery in England at this time, who argue that actually it was people like Peter who helped abolish slavery before the Somerset decision that made that decision possible by running away, because they destabilized the entire slave system. If you couldn't keep your enslaved people with you, they kept running away, then the whole system falls apart. And so by the time 1772 arrives, slavery was already teetering on the brink in England. So it's a fascinating question, and I think that advertisement from 1750 is part of the lead up to that case and why it happens. Yeah.
And it's quite a significant year, isn't it, 1772? Because a lot of people obviously associate with abolished slavery in the 1800s, and yet actually it's a lot earlier. But it's just because it was illegal, they were doing it illegally.
Right. So that was in England, right, in 1772. Within the empire, it was more complicated. It's not till really 1838. And in some places not till later than that. And of course, 1772 is also significant for the American Revolution, right, which breaks out shortly thereafter. And one of the reasons why, and this is controversial, but I think there's good evidence for it, one of the reasons why the American Revolution breaks out is because Somerset, the decision freeing the slaves in England, threatened slavery in the United States. So the activities of these runaways actually had a profound influence on global history. And they're one of the reasons why my country exists today.
Yeah, I use 1772 only because I was born in 72, but I didn't there. And then I found out that fact. So it's brilliant.
Good contribution. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Could I ask a bit more? You talked about Peter probably going to London because there was a big population of black people already there. So what kind of lives were most of those people living in London?
Working class lives, for the most part, right?
But not all slaves. You're not saying that No.
No,
They were,
there's a sizable free black population, in part because of all this running away that was happening. We don't have a lot of information. We have, as I mentioned, baptismal records. We have births. We have deaths. Marriage records are fascinating because it shows that a lot of black Britons were marrying white Britons at this time. A lot of interracial marriages going on in London at this time. So we can tell little snippets of what their lives might have been like. And we can look at paintings and images from this period. And we can see what their lives were like. But mostly they were servants, right? Or they were street peddlers, okay? Or they were sailors. Working in the British Navy was one of the best routes to freedom and independence for someone who was black and British at this time. So.
thank you.
Can I just say, it was good, interesting, and educational to hear why the sugar industry came to a halt in the Caribbean because of the boycott. And I think even now, that because there wasn't demand for sugar and other things because it was slave that was producing it. And I think even now the Africans and other Asian country maybe who produce this thing, but mainly the Africans, in the shops they're so expensive, when the white maybe wholesaler buy from Africa and they bring it to this country, they pay next to nothing the farmers in those countries, and they bring it here and they put it in the shops, and it's so expensive that nobody would buy this boycotted.
Yeah.
And I think that needs to be addressed. I think if you, like bananas as well, same thing. South American banana or Brazil came from bananas from Brazil and places. Is a lot cheaper. And people would buy these bananas than they would buy Caribbean bananas. Caribbean bananas is put on its own, isolated in the shell, and very expensive. Nobody would buy them.
Yeah.
So you don't get a turnover.
Yes.
They're not helping the farmers in the third world country.
Yes.
We need to go to the co-op.
Safiah, I think it's
Bananas at the co-op.
Safiah, I think it's fair to say that free labor sugar was much more expensive than slave labor sugar. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the reason why the boycott kind of fizzled out was because people couldn't commit to it because the sugar was so expensive and it was difficult to get. But as well, the society had to come with other sweeteners like syrup and honey, and those in itself were expensive. And so it was kind of struggle to find an alternative because sugar wasn't just used for tea, it was used for cooking, it was also used as a medicine. So people needed it, people in the upper class and people had it. So that's kind of the reason why it fizzled out, because the price and the difficulty to obtain it, really.
Can I ask what actually happened to people who were slaves in the big families, the families that operated them, that had slaves here and elsewhere? What happened, particularly the ones that had them in England, when the trade was abolished? What happened to all those people that were working in the fields in England at the time? Did they suddenly get paid, or did they get let go? Or did were they given the choice of going or staying? Or did they have anything that prevented them? Suppose some of them had family in the West Indies. If they wanted to go back, could they go back? What was their status? Because they presumably didn't have the right to vote, didn't have lots of rights that other people had.
Yeah. So it's complicated, like all historical questions are complicated. And there are different things happen to different people. So one famous example is the colony of Sierra Leone, which is now the country of Sierra Leone in West Africa. So this was established by abolitionists after the Somerset decision in 1772 to send the so-called surplus free black population from London back to Africa. Okay, and they set up an anti-slavery outpost in Freetown, Sierra Leone, and it still exists today. And it's my own research, my dissertation research is on Sierra Leone. So that's one way that this was handled. Okay. Other people, it was kind of a case-by-case basis. And one famous example is Samuel Johnson, right? So you know this story. So this is the guy famous for his dictionary. He's from Lichfield near Birmingham, and he had an enslaved servant. And he eventually emancipated this man and set him up with a farm in Lichfield. Okay, this is a small town north of Birmingham. And to this day, that man's ancestors still live in the area. And they still have property there, and they are shop owners, and they are business people, and they are ministers. So you can kind of you can trace these individual stories sometimes, and different people's lives take different trajectories. It's impossible to come up with one composite image because it happened in bits and pieces all over. That's a good question. Other comments? Other questions? We've still got about 5-10 minutes, yeah.
Going to the boycott history, I think the influence of that was for the Bristol bus boycott and how effective that was even in changing legislation. So, it's interesting to see that that's how far back it is.
Yeah, I mean, the Quakers saw boycotting as an opportunity because, telling, the people who were involved in the slave trade to stop it is not going to make them stop it. But if you hit them where it hurts most, where they end up losing money, that's what catches their eye and gets their attention. And they're like, okay, wait a minute, let's kind of sort something out and see what we can do. And they were effective. The multiple boycotts that happened after that, they were effective.
Final word.
Did slavery get as far south as Argentina, which after all became a huge power in 1900? Was very important.
Yeah, as a Spanish colony, absolutely.
Yes.
I've worked on that story myself a little bit, and unfortunately, it was coupled with the genocide of Native peoples in South America, right? So the Spanish settlers, in particular, would wipe out the local population, indigenous population in Argentina, and they would bring enslaved workers with them to work the land. That's a sad, genocidal story, but yeah.
Why could they not enslave the local people?
Well, there are all sorts of interesting answers to that question. One of them is disease, because indigenous Americans did not have the same resistance to diseases as Europeans and Africans did. And so they tended to suffer from smallpox in particular, especially badly. Another reason is that they knew the land very well. This was their native land, right? This was their territory, and they were defended violently with their lives. And Africans brought in from across the Atlantic were perceived as being less likely to foment an anti-colonial rebellion if they were enslaved. Okay, but there are all sorts of other reasons as well. Those are two.
Yeah. But they did rise in the Haitian Revolution. I mean, they proved everybody wrong.
Africans did, yes, that's right. No one saw that coming.
No, and this is the one story that nobody seems to know about. And it's not in the history books.
Yes, that's true. Yes, still to this day, I just gave a talk to secondary school students, year 10 students in Birmingham a couple days ago. And I asked them what they knew about slavery and the slave trade. I asked them what they knew about the Haitian Revolution. Not a one was able to answer the question. And these were students from Birmingham who come from a West Indian background or come from an African background, right? You would expect this is part of their identity, this is part of their story, and they're completely ignorant. And I think that that's part of how slavery has been erased from our historical consciousness. So yeah, we have to talk about Haiti.
And that feeds into the racism because a lot of people don't feel that they belong to this country because they don't know their history. And if they did know their history, then it would be a different story.
So that might be a good optimistic note to end on. We all need to learn more about the Haitian Revolution, folks. Okay, all right. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you very much indeed for coming so far to talk to us tonight. Let's give a round.